Well, one of the things that often happens as a chaplain that goes beyond prison ministry, beyond hospital ministry, is when you're called upon to conduct various services. You know, weddings sometimes are fun. Funerals are certainly different. Baptismal services, of course, preaching assignments at various places, the dedication of babies. But in all cases, we want to be professional and well prepared if we're going to minister in one of these settings. In this course, we're focusing on a funeral service because it is some cases the more difficult one to do, and it's one that most chaplains are called upon to do at one time or another. I've often said that I prefer funerals to weddings because with a funeral, at least you know the outcome, but with a wedding, again, only the Lord knows. In conducting a funeral as a chaplain, you may or may not have much knowledge of the family or even the person who has passed away. But here's some guidelines that I think should help you. If you're doing a funeral or a memorial service, of course, you want to be prepared. You want to develop a clear service outline that includes an introduction, an opportunity for members of the family to share, and a healthy close to the service. If you're doing a burial service, you want to take time with the family and friends after the service, to help them not to forget their loved one. You also want to be willing to call upon them and visit them later. But again, the goal is not to preach to them, but to be there to give care and comfort. There's a lot of good books and resources available on how to conduct a healthy funeral, weddings, baby dedications, etc. And as a chaplain who is a licensed and or ordained minister of the gospel, I would encourage you to pick up those resources. You can find them online or at any good local Christian bookstore. When you're doing a funeral service, of course, recognize that people are in various stages of grief. Grief is something that everyone experiences. Grief often goes through stages. They include shock and denial, having to deal with fantasy versus reality, ultimately the release of repressed emotions, hopefully connected to thoughts regarding the one that they've lost, eventually learning to live with the memories and accepting and affirming life as good in spite of their loss. So one of the things that can help, and I've got this simple acronym here, the ASC, it's the Admit, Submit, Commit. That is, if someone's going through grief and you're trying to help them with it, you want to help them to admit that the loss is real. Yes, I've lost my loved one. David had to face that. When he had lost his child, he made the statement, my son will not come to me, but I will eventually go to him. He had to face the reality of his loss. We have to do that. We have to submit to the process of change. That is, that life is not going to be the same. It's not going to go back to what it was. It has to move forward into whatever it's going to be. And there's a process of growth and change that we have to go through, and we must be willing to commit ourselves to that process. So if you're working with someone, ministering to someone, the goal is to help them to overcome loss, recognizing first and foremost that grief is a natural healing process that will occur in anyone that's willing to take the journey. Now, the journeys happen because a loss has occurred, but they still have to be willing to go through the journey of grieving and mourning the loss of their loved one. Starting at the funeral service, you'll find that many people will be in a state of shock, sense of numbness and unreality. Many feel helpless and vulnerable, filled with fear and sadness, some anger, guilt, etc. All of that is possible at a funeral service. Cognitive distortion can occur, and you can see this during a funeral service as well. People have a hard time organizing their thoughts. They can have difficulty concentrating, have a lot of confusion, etc., because of the loss of their loved one. Because of all the frantic time and activity, etc. There can be physical aspects, issues that happen during a funeral service, which includes fatigue and a decrease in appetite, lots of stress and distress, hypoactivity or hyperactivity, either one, and thus they're much more susceptible to illness themselves. So taking care of themselves is important. So as a chaplain, you want to try and help them to know these things, that they're normal parts of grieving, especially during the time of a funeral service and beyond. So you want to be aware of the needs that they may be facing. Often people will be unaware of others' needs, and they'll withdraw from or avoid others. They become less productive in work, etc., and relationships can become strained. So as a chaplain, you must be aware of this. One book that has been very helpful to people has been my book, Grief Relief. And a shorter version of that book is called Mourning to Dancing, which provides principles to people who are going through loss. And as a chaplain, one of the things that you have available to you is what's often called bibliotherapy, or books that can be therapeutic and helpful to people. And one of those books that could be a great help is the book Grief Relief or Mourning to Dancing, which is available through booksbyvision.com. Let's skip down to then the funeral service, the purpose of grief and mourning. Because grief and mourning really does have a purpose. It's going somewhere. And grief responses are simply natural reactions to a loss. People protest at the loss of a loved one. They wish they could do something to undo what is done, but of course they can't. The ultimate goal of grief is to take people beyond these reactions to the loss and come to a place of true acceptance. And to do that requires some work. The therapeutic purpose of grieving and mourning is to get to the point where they can live with the loss in a healthy way. Now this takes time, it takes energy, and of course this takes the devotion of a caregiver, especially a chaplain, to come alongside and to help them. So what can you do? Well, you help them to adjust to the new relationships that they'll now have because of the loss of their loved one, which will help them to develop a new sense of themselves, to reflect on the changes that have now occurred. You can help them in very practical ways as well to look at how do I adjust to changes in finances and housing and other relationships. You want to help them especially not to make rash decisions, which often can be disastrous when someone has just lost a loved one. Ultimately, to help them find, new people, objects, pursuits to be able to invest their emotions in. Grief and loss, and what you begin to see, especially at a funeral or when you're called upon, when someone has just passed away or someone is facing divorce, is really an area where a chaplain can step in and be a great help. And so I encourage you to get resources. In some of the courses now to follow, we go into great depth in dealing with some of these issues, especially grief and loss and crisis and counseling in general, all of which will give you the additional skills that you'll need to be a highly effective chaplain ministering to people in their time of greatest need. Another time of great need happens when there's abuse within the family. Sad to say, there is a lot of abuse that happens even within Christian homes. Well, abuse can be either physical, emotional, psychological, can be verbal, financial, or spiritual. Domestic violence is about power and control, and whoever has the power is the one who abuses the person who has no power. Well, as a chaplain, what do you do? How do you deal with? What knowledge do you need to be effective in stepping into the middle of a domestic violence situation? Well, first of all, let's understand who the victims are. Some statistics will help. 91 to 95% of all documented cases of domestic violence are against women. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen to men, it does, but it's significantly rarer than it is with women. Domestic violence occurs in all classes and groups of people. So, wealthy people, poor people, educated people, and uneducated people, people with excellent income and employment, and those that have limited employment opportunities, people with physical abilities, and those that are disabled, married, single, all races, all ethnicities. It is something that cuts across the board. Everybody and has been affected in one way or another by domestic violence. Abuse, of course, is not something that just happens, it's something that people learn. Yet, in reality, there is no excuse. Some would say, well, it's not my fault, I was drinking. No excuse. They made me angry. No excuse. Mental illness. No, none of that is an excuse, although all of them can be exacerbating reasons why the abuse has occurred. In most cases, abusers plan their abuse. 75% of abusers were abused themselves growing up, or they witnessed abuse in their homes. Thus, they have great difficulty in trusting others, or often filled with jealousy rooted in insecurity. They often isolate their spouses from their family and friends. And when you mix that with the Molotov cocktail of alcohol or drugs, can set the stage for an explosion. How do you identify then as a chaplain if someone has been abused? Well, you want to look for, or more likely one who is likely to be an abuser. Again, someone who is highly jealous and or extremely insecure and attempts to control others in every relationship are the kind of person that is likely to abuse. They often have unrealistic expectations about the role of their spouse or their children. They usually will blame others for their problems, are highly sensitive, easily offended, and have some history of abuse going back usually to childhood of animals or of children. Oftentimes we see that also very highly religious people tend to be more likely candidate to be an abuser. Well, what happens then with the victim? Well, victims feel fear, loneliness, hopelessness, powerlessness, and anger. And of course, we're going to cover this in much greater detail in our course on family violence. It's a very important course. You'll learn all about family violence in general, but especially how to effectively minister to those that have been abused, as well as ministry to the abusers as well. So what is the role of a chaplain in abusive situations? Well, again, part of our responsibility is to remember that we're ministers of the gospel. We should remember that, of course, the ideal is that husbands love their wives and wives honor their husbands. But obviously, that isn't the case when there's domestic violence within the home. How can you help? Well, you can break the silence and allow the victim to talk. You can help them find a support group. You don't want to force them to blame the victim. You want to protect the victim. Not telling the person that he or she should leave, allow the person to make that decision for themselves. Helping them to develop a simple plan of action and giving them comfort through prayer and the ministry of coming alongside, if you will. Provide literature to help them as well. If someone has been actively abused and is in a state of crisis, they may need medical care. They may need advanced psychological care. So part of your responsibility then as a chaplain is to function in a type of triage, to try and determine what the needs are. And some of the best care you can ever give is to then plug them into the place where they can get the needs met. So again, how can we help? By comforting the victim. And the victim may be, again, not just someone who has been hit or hurt, but the children as well. If they've heard it or seen it, They are victims of child abuse and they need care as well. Praying for them, praying for the family, etc. Allowing them to vent and or express the emotions as they come. As a chaplain, remember that the offender is the responsible one, and we must remember that abuse is a crime. It's a crime against the innocent. It's a crime against the weak. And we recognize that God is opposed to those who abuse people. You can see the scripture there in that PowerPoint. God's really against those that are abusers. So again, the chaplain's role is to recognize that there may be police involvement in courts and protective orders. Again, a protective order is a restraining order. It's designed to keep the perpetrator away from the victim. One of the things that we know is that true perpetrators often simply ignore these, but someone who it's not their lifestyle to abuse, but it's maybe a one-time event, it can be a very helpful thing to provide that to them to show them how serious their action has been. So a protective order, again, is a court order, but it will hopefully help give some protection to the victim. Police may have an arrest warrant when a protective order is in place. They may have to go to court, and part of the role as a chaplain is to minister again both to the victim's family but also to the perpetrator. So you need to be aware of the various systems involved, and again the family court, the criminal court, etc. Remember, there's hope for the victims and there's forgiveness for the perpetrator. And there are many programs that can help both the perpetrator and the victim. One of the goals is to try and salvage the family if possible, but it's not always possible. We must recognize that it's their choices and their decisions that have got them in the position that they are. So the responsibility of a minister, really any believer, is to help people find God or restore the relationship with God if they've strayed. Many people will ask, well, why does this kind of thing happen? Why was I abused? Why did God let this happen to me? Like Job, we cry with them, but we also shout in victory. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Our trust is in God, and we must make the best decisions we can. The enemy brought the suffering in the life of Job, but God allows all these things to somehow work for good by his grace. Well, the role of a chaplain is a very important one. Whether you're involved in general chaplaincy ministry, whether you're working in a nursing home, whether you're serving in a hospital, a prison setting, however you're ministering, recognize you have an important role to play. Your job is to be a caregiver. Your job is to present the gospel of Christ. Your job is to be a carer and a comforter in a time of need. I'm just excited that you've taken the time to prepare yourself in this introductory course, and I'm trusting that you will continue on with your studies, because to become a certified chaplain really gives to you the credentials that you need to be not just effective, but to create a long-term ministry that will affect dozens, even hundreds of lives for the sake of the kingdom of God. So God bless you as you continue to study and prepare yourself for service as a chaplain in the service of Christ.